Zexhai walked through the bright halls of the Kethmoran Academy with his 4 legs clicking softly on the metal floor. His green skin showed the pale marks that meant he was nervous, though he tried to hide it from the other students. Today was the day he would get his final research assignment, the one that would decide if he became a real xenobiologist or had to find some other job in the Empire. The Academy building rose high into the purple sky of his home world, its walls made of the same silver metal that covered most Kethmoran cities. Through the tall windows he could see the transport ships moving between the floating platforms that held their civilization above the toxic swamps below. Everything was clean and ordered, just like Kethmoran society had been for over 2,000 years. Zexhai entered the assignment hall where Professor Velthara waited behind her curved desk. She was old even by Kethmoran standards, her skin dark green with age spots, her 6 eyes sharp and knowing. Behind her, a wall screen showed the star map of their empire, with hundreds of conquered worlds marked in blue light. "Student Zexhai," she said without looking up from her datapad, "your grades are acceptable but not outstanding. Your practical work shows promise but lacks the cold analysis we expect from our xenobiologists." He stood straighter, trying not to let his skin show more pale nervousness marks. "I am ready for any assignment, Professor." She finally looked at him with all 6 eyes, studying him like he was some specimen in a lab. "The High Command has a special project. We are preparing to add another world to our empire, a small planet they call Earth, inhabited by a primitive species called humans." Zexhai felt excitement rise in his chest. A real conquest study was a huge honor for a student. "What do you need me to observe, Professor?" "The humans are about to engage in one of their primitive wars. You will study their military behavior patterns so our generals can plan the most efficient conquest. Your job is simple. Watch how they fight, document their weaknesses, and report back with tactical data." She touched her datapad, and the wall screen changed to show a blue and green world spinning slowly in space. Earth, 3rd planet from a yellow star. The humans are the dominant species, though they barely qualify as intelligent by our standards. Short-lived, weak bodies, primitive technology. They still use chemical explosives and metal projectiles as weapons. The professor stood and walked to the screen, pointing at the planet with one of her long fingers. "What makes this assignment perfect for a student is that humans are so simple to understand. They have only 2 genders. They live in small family groups and they make decisions based on emotion instead of logic. Our previous observations show they are easily frightened and quick to surrender when facing superior force." Zexhai watched the planet turn and wondered what these humans looked like. The Kethmoran Empire had conquered 47 worlds in the past 3 centuries, and every species had fallen within days, once they understood the hopelessness of fighting an advanced civilization. "How long do you expect the conquest to take, Professor?" 3 days, perhaps 4. These humans have divided themselves into hundreds of small nations that fight each other constantly. They waste their resources on internal conflicts instead of preparing for real threats. When our fleet arrives, they will probably surrender immediately to avoid destruction." She returned to her desk and pulled out a small device that looked like a metal egg. "This is your observation pod. It has stealth technology that will make you invisible to human detection systems. You can position it anywhere on their planet and observe their military activities safely." Zexhai took the device carefully. It felt warm in his hands and hummed with power. "Where should I begin my observations?" "Intelligence reports indicate a significant human military conflict is about to begin in their eastern continent. Find a group of human soldiers and document how they behave under combat stress. Pay special attention to their panic responses, surrender patterns, and how quickly their command structure breaks down under pressure." The professor sat back down and began typing on her datapad. "Remember, Zexhai, this is not a difficult assignment. Humans are one of the most primitive species we have encountered. They still fight wars on the surface of their planet instead of in space. They use individual soldiers instead of automated systems. Most importantly, they form emotional attachments that make them weak and predictable." She looked up at him again. "Your report should focus on exploiting these emotional weaknesses. When humans care about something, they become irrational. When they are afraid, they make poor decisions. Document these patterns so our military planners can use them during the invasion." Zexhai nodded and put the observation device in his equipment bag. "When do I leave for Earth?" "Immediately. A transport ship is waiting to take you to the edge of their solar system. From there, you will deploy your observation pod and begin your study. The High Command expects your preliminary report within 10 of their days. As he turned to leave, Professor Valthera called after him. One more thing, student. Do not let human emotions confuse you. They are a primitive species that has not learned to control their feelings as we have. Their anger, fear, and attachment to others are signs of evolutionary weakness, not strength. Remember that when you write your report. Zexhai left the academy feeling proud and excited. His first real research assignment would help the Empire add another world to their collection. He imagined returning with detailed data about human weaknesses, earning praise from the professors and maybe even recognition from the High Command. The transport ship waited at the Academy's landing platform, its engines already warming up for the journey to Earth. As Zexhai climbed aboard, he looked back at his homeworld one last time. When he returned, he would be a real xenobiologist with an important conquest study to his name. He had no idea that what he was about to witness would change everything he believed about strength, weakness, and what it truly meant to be intelligent. The observation pod settled quietly into the rocky hills above a human military base just as their sun was rising. Zexhai checked his instruments and confirmed that the stealth field was working perfectly. To any human sensors, this spot would appear empty except for rocks and small earth plants. He adjusted his viewing screen to focus on the base below. It was much smaller than he had expected, just a collection of brown buildings surrounded by a fence made of metal wire. Primitive vehicles moved between the structures, and he could see small figures in matching clothes walking around. These were his first real humans. Through his equipment, Zexhai could hear their voices talking in their strange language. The translation device worked quickly to change their words into something he could understand. What surprised him was how much they talked to each other. Kethmoran soldiers communicated only when necessary, but these humans seemed to chat constantly about things that had nothing to do with their military duties. He focused on one group of 8 soldiers gathered around some kind of heating device. The leader appeared to be a human male with short brown hair and marks on his uniform that probably showed rank. The translation system identified him as Sergeant Jake Morrison. Zexhai began recording everything about this group for his report. "Coffee tastes like dirt again today," said Private Lisa Kane, a female with yellow hair tied back. She held a metal cup and made a face that Zexhai recognized as disgust. "At least it is hot dirt," replied Corporal Amy Foster, laughing at her own words. The others joined in with sounds that his equipment identified as human laughter. Zexhai made a note that humans wasted time on unnecessary social bonding instead of focusing on military preparedness. Lieutenant Ben Rodriguez approached the group carrying papers. "Orders came in," he announced. "We move out in 2 hours to escort a supply convoy through the valley. Intelligence says enemy forces might try to attack the trucks." Zexhai watched carefully as the humans received this information. According to his training, primitive species should show fear or excitement when facing possible combat. Instead, these humans just nodded and began checking their weapons with calm efficiency. One of them, Specialist Tony Clark, even continued eating his morning meal while cleaning his rifle. "Same route as last week?" asked Sergeant Morrison. "Different. Command wants us to take the mountain road. It is longer but supposed to be safer," Lieutenant Rodriguez explained. "Safer for the trucks maybe, but not for us if we get stuck up there," said Amy Foster. Her voice carried worry, but she did not seem to be asking to avoid the mission. She was just stating a tactical concern. Zexhai found this confusing. The humans clearly understood the danger they faced, but none of them suggested refusing the orders or finding excuses to avoid the mission. In his studies of other conquered species, fear usually led to attempts to escape dangerous situations. As the humans prepared for their mission, Zexhai observed their behavior patterns more closely. They helped each other check equipment, shared extra supplies, and made jokes to ease tension. Private Kane gave Tony Clark some kind of food item from her personal supplies. Corporal Foster helped a younger soldier named Pete Williams adjust his gear properly. "This is your first convoy escort," Foster told Williams. "Stay close to me and do exactly what I tell you. The mountain road has lots of places for ambushes, so keep your eyes moving and your weapon ready." Williams nodded seriously. "What if we get separated?" "You will not get separated because I will not let that happen," Foster replied firmly. "We all go home together or nobody goes home. That is how this works." Zexhai paused his recording. Foster's statement made no tactical sense. Why would soldiers risk the success of their mission to ensure everyone survived? In Kethmoran military doctrine, individual casualties were acceptable if they helped achieve the objective. But these humans seemed to consider the survival of their group members as important as completing their assigned task. The convoy mission proceeded as predicted. 3 large trucks carrying supplies moved slowly up the mountain road, while the 8 soldiers spread out to provide protection. HFY followed their progress through his observation equipment, waiting for the enemy attack that would let him study human combat behavior. The attack came at a narrow point, where the road curved around a large rock formation. Enemy soldiers with automatic weapons opened fire from hidden positions above the convoy. HFY immediately began recording, expecting to see the humans panic and abandon their positions. Instead, he witnessed something that confused him completely. The humans moved with quick precision, taking cover and returning fire while shouting information to each other. Sergeant Morrison coordinated their response while Lieutenant Rodriguez moved toward the trapped convoy trucks. "Kane, Foster, take the high ground on the left," Morrison called out. "Clark, Williams, cover the trucks. I need suppressing fire on that ridge." What happened next made HFY question his translation equipment. Instead of following the logical choice to retreat when facing superior firepower, Private Kane and Corporal Foster actually advanced up the hill toward the enemy positions. They moved from rock to rock, covering each other and drawing enemy fire away from the vulnerable trucks. "Rodriguez is hit," Tony Clark shouted from near the convoy. HFY watched as the lieutenant dragged himself behind a truck wheel, blood visible on his uniform. According to military logic, this should have caused panic and poor decision-making among the humans. Instead, it seemed to make them fight harder. Specialist Clark immediately left his covered position and ran across open ground under enemy fire to reach the wounded lieutenant. This made no sense at all. Clark was exposing himself to almost certain death to help one injured soldier, potentially compromising the entire mission. But somehow Clark reached Rodriguez safely and began treating his wounds while still firing at the enemy. Meanwhile, Kane and Foster had climbed high enough to attack the ambush positions from the side. Their bold advance forced the enemy soldiers to retreat, ending the threat to the convoy. As the fighting stopped, HFY observed the aftermath. The humans gathered around their wounded lieutenant, checking his injuries and calling for medical evacuation. Their obvious concern for one individual seemed to override any satisfaction about winning the battle. "You are going to be fine," Foster told Rodriguez while pressing cloth against his wound. "Medic helicopter is already on the way." "Did everyone else make it?" Rodriguez asked weakly. "Everyone is safe," Morrison confirmed. "The convoy got through without damage." Later that day, back at their base, HFY watched the humans discuss the mission. They did not celebrate their victory or analyze their tactical success. Instead, they focused entirely on their wounded comrade and how they could have prevented his injury. As he prepared his first report, HFY struggled to understand what he had observed. These humans showed clear signs of emotional weakness. They formed attachments to individuals. They took unnecessary risks to help each other. And they seemed to value personal relationships over mission objectives. Yet somehow these same weaknesses had led them to victory against superior enemy forces. He wrote carefully about their tactical errors and emotional instabilities. But deep in his mind, a small doubt began to grow. 3 weeks after the convoy mission, HFY detected massive enemy troop movements on his sensors. Thousands of soldiers with heavy weapons were moving toward the human base from 3 directions. His equipment calculated that the attacking force outnumbered the defenders by more than 5 to 1, with superior firepower and armored vehicles. He immediately focused all his recording systems on the base, expecting to document a quick human surrender. This would be perfect data for his report, showing how humans collapsed when facing overwhelming odds. But as he watched the defenders prepare for battle, something felt different from his previous observations. The base commander received evacuation orders through their communication system. Command headquarters told all personnel to retreat immediately to a safer position 50 kilometers away. The message was clear: abandon the base and save themselves before the enemy arrived. HFY waited for the humans to begin their withdrawal. Any intelligent species would follow orders to preserve their lives and fighting capability. Instead, he watched Sergeant Morrison gather his squad around a table covered with maps and papers. "Listen up," Morrison said to his 8 soldiers. "Command wants us to pull out, but there is a problem. Millfield Village is 12 kilometers from here with about 300 civilians. The enemy advance will reach them before evacuation can be completed. Lieutenant Rodriguez, still recovering from his wound but back on duty, pointed to marks on the map. Children's school, medical clinic, elderly care facility. They need at least 6 more hours to get everyone out safely. Private Kane looked at the tactical display showing enemy positions. If we leave now, those people die. If we stay, we probably die, added Corporal Foster quietly. HFY expected this logical assessment to end the discussion. Surely these primitive beings would choose their own survival over strangers they had never met. But Sergeant Morrison stood up and looked at each member of his squad. Command says we can go. Nobody will blame us for following orders. But those civilians did not choose to be in this war. The kids in that school did not ask to be here. Morrison paused and took a deep breath. I am staying to buy them time. Anyone who wants to leave should go now. No shame in following orders. What happened next destroyed every assumption HFY had about human behavior. Not a single soldier moved toward the exit. Instead, they began checking their weapons and preparing defensive positions. Private Kane actually smiled as she loaded extra ammunition into her rifle. Guess we are having a really bad day, she said to Tony Clark. Been through worse, Clark replied, though HFY's analysis suggested this was mathematically impossible. Within an hour, word had spread throughout the base. 53 human soldiers made the same impossible choice, to remain and face certain death to protect people they did not even know. The base commander, Colonel Frank Hayes, personally called for volunteers to stay behind while the rest evacuated. He expected perhaps a dozen brave fools. Instead, nearly every soldier volunteered. HFY watched in growing confusion as the humans transformed their small base into a fortress. They moved supplies, reinforced buildings, and established overlapping fields of fire with the calm efficiency of engineers building a bridge. None of them showed the panic or despair he expected from soldiers facing hopeless odds. Medic Sarah Phillips set up a treatment station in the most protected building. Going to be busy tonight, she told her assistant, Pete Williams, who had volunteered to stay despite being the youngest soldier on the base. Are you scared? Williams asked her. Terrified, Phillips replied honestly. But those kids in Millfield are more scared than we are. Our job is to make sure they get out safely. The enemy attack began at sunset with artillery bombardment that shook the ground around HFY's observation post. His equipment registered explosive forces that should have destroyed the primitive human buildings. But somehow the defenders survived in their reinforced positions and began returning fire. For 72 hours, HFY recorded events that challenged everything he understood about warfare. The humans did not fight like any species he had studied. They fought like the rules of biology and physics did not apply to them. Engineer Danny Cooper continued repairing damaged defensive systems even as enemy shells exploded around him. When shrapnel cut his arm, he tied cloth around the wound and kept working. When his tools were destroyed, he used pieces of metal and wire to improvise repairs. Northeast wall is about to collapse, he reported over the radio, while running between buildings under heavy fire. Can you fix it? Asked Colonel Hayes. Not really, but I can make it pretend to be a wall for a few more hours, Cooper replied. Private First Class Helen Burke took position at the main gate when her entire squad was killed by a direct artillery hit. For 6 hours, she held that position alone against waves of enemy infantry. When her rifle ammunition ran out, she used a pistol. When the pistol was empty, she threw grenades. When the grenades were gone, she used her knife. HFY watched through his sensors as Burke continued fighting with injuries that should have killed her. She bled from multiple wounds. Her left arm hung useless at her side and medical scanners showed she was running on pure determination, yet she never retreated from her position. Burke, fall back to the inner perimeter, Morrison ordered through the radio. Negative, Sergeant. They get through here, they reach the village road. Not happening on my watch, Burke replied between bursts of gunfire. On the second day, Captain Mike Stevens took command when Colonel Hayes was killed by sniper fire. Stevens had been wounded in the first hour of fighting, but he moved through the base coordinating defenses while bleeding from holes in his chest and leg. How much ammunition left? He asked his soldiers. Maybe 2 hours at current rate, reported Amy Foster. Make it last 4, Stevens ordered. How exactly do we do that, sir? Asked Tony Clark. Stevens smiled through the blood on his face. Shoot better. Somehow, impossibly, the humans made their ammunition last. They improvised weapons from broken equipment. They turned destroyed vehicles into barriers. When their communication system failed, they developed hand signals that let them coordinate attacks with frightening precision. On the final day, as HFY's sensors detected human reinforcements approaching, he realized something that made his skin show deep purple marks of fear. These humans were not just surviving against impossible odds. They were winning. The enemy force that had come to destroy a small base and slaughter civilians was retreating in disorder. Thousands of soldiers with advanced weapons were running from 53 humans who refused to accept defeat. As the siege ended and evacuation transports landed safely at Millfield Village, HFY stared at his recorded data in shock. Every tactical model, every behavioral prediction, every assumption about primitive species had been proven completely wrong. The humans had not fought this battle with superior technology or numbers. They had fought it with something his advanced civilization could not understand: the absolute refusal to let innocent people die while they still drew breath. Private Kane, exhausted and covered in dirt and blood, helped load the last wounded soldier onto a medical transport. "Think they will send us somewhere quiet next time?" she asked Morrison. Morrison looked back at their ruined base, then toward Millfield Village where children were safely boarding evacuation vehicles. "Probably not," he said. "But that is okay. Quiet is overrated anyway." For the first time since beginning his study, HFY began to understand that he was not observing a primitive species. He was documenting something far more dangerous than advanced technology or superior weapons. He was watching beings who could transform themselves into forces of nature when protecting others. After the siege ended, HFY should have felt satisfied with his research data. He had recorded exactly what the High Command wanted: detailed observations of human military behavior under extreme stress. But instead of satisfaction, he felt something completely foreign to his species: a deep, growing fear that had nothing to do with physical danger. For days after the battle, he replayed the recordings obsessively. Every time he watched the footage, the same impossible truth emerged. The humans had not won through superior tactics or equipment. They had won by becoming something that defied every law of biology and psychology that Kethmoran science understood. His analysis equipment confirmed what his eyes had seen. Helen Burke had continued fighting for hours with blood loss that should have rendered her unconscious. Danny Cooper had performed complex repairs while suffering from injuries that should have prevented coherent thought. Captain Stevens had coordinated a successful defense while his vital signs showed he should have been dead. But the medical impossibilities were not what terrified HFY. What filled him with existential dread was the realization that these humans had consciously chosen to transcend their biological limitations. They had decided that protecting innocent civilians was more important than their own survival. And somehow that decision had made them capable of impossible things. He began studying other human conflicts in the historical databases aboard his ship. The pattern repeated across their entire species. During something called World War II, humans had fought against impossible odds to protect others. In a place called Stalingrad, human soldiers had held a city against a vastly superior force for months, fighting in the ruins until almost every building was destroyed. At a location called Thermopylae, 300 human warriors had stood against an army of hundreds of thousands, choosing certain death to delay an invasion that threatened their families. They had died to the last man, but their sacrifice had inspired their entire civilization to eventual victory. In countless smaller conflicts, human soldiers had thrown themselves on explosive devices to protect their comrades. Medics had run into active combat zones to save wounded enemies. Pilots had deliberately crashed their damaged aircraft into military targets rather than abandon their missions. HFY's skin showed constant purple fear marks as he processed this data. Every example revealed the same terrifying truth: humans became exponentially more dangerous when they were protecting something they loved. The emotion that Kethmoran science considered a weakness was actually their greatest weapon. He began monitoring global human communications to understand their current military capabilities. What he discovered made his fear deepen into something approaching panic. The humans were not just a species that fought beyond biological limits. They were a species that constantly prepared for threats they had never encountered. Their military strategists wrote papers about defending against alien invasion, Their scientists developed weapons designed to fight enemies with unknown capabilities. Their fiction writers created stories about interstellar war and the tactics needed to defeat advanced civilizations. Most terrifying of all, they seemed to understand instinctively that their emotional bonds were their greatest strength. Their military training deliberately fostered fierce loyalty between soldiers. Their cultural stories celebrated heroes who sacrificed themselves for others. Their entire civilization was built around the idea that some things were worth dying for. HFY found himself studying a human military leader named Jake Morrison more closely. Since the siege, Morrison had been promoted and given command of a larger unit. In interviews with military reporters, he spoke casually about concepts that chilled HFY to his core. "People ask me how we held out against those odds," Morrison told one interviewer. "Truth is, we never considered failure an option. Those civilians needed 6 hours to evacuate safely. We decided to give them 6 hours, and the enemy did not get a vote in that decision." "But surely you were afraid of dying," the reporter pressed. Morrison smiled in a way that made HFY's translation software struggle to interpret the expression. "Of course we were afraid. Fear is what makes you human. But fear of death is nothing compared to fear of letting innocent people die when you could have saved them. Once you understand that, you become capable of things that surprise even yourself." The interviewer asked about his wounded soldiers. Morrison's expression became serious. Every person who stayed behind knew they might not go home. But they also knew that 300 civilians would definitely not go home if we left. The math was simple. Risk 50 lives to save 300. Any decent human being makes that choice. HFY paused the recording. Morrison spoke about sacrificing his entire unit as if it were an obvious decision that required no special courage. But the data clearly showed that each of those 50 soldiers had families, friends, and personal goals. They had given up everything they cared about to protect strangers. He studied the families of the soldiers who had died in the siege. Instead of anger at their government for allowing the sacrifice, they expressed pride in their loved ones. Parents spoke of being honored that their children had died protecting civilians. Spouses talked about how their partners had lived up to their highest values. The human emotional system was not just illogical, it was perfectly designed to create soldiers who became more effective as the stakes increased. Fear motivated them to fight harder. Love made them willing to die for others. Grief for fallen comrades transformed into unstoppable determination. HFY began to understand why the Kethmoran Empire had never encountered anything like this. Every other species they had conquered was intelligent and logical. When faced with superior force, they surrendered to preserve their civilization. They calculated odds and made rational decisions. But humans were not entirely rational. They were driven by emotions that could override biological self-preservation. They valued abstract concepts like honor, duty, and sacrifice more than their own lives. Most dangerously, they could inspire each other to transcend individual limitations through shared emotional bonds. He watched footage of human soldiers preparing for dangerous missions. They did not focus on survival techniques or superior equipment. Instead, they talked about the people they were protecting, looked at pictures of their families, and reminded each other why their mission mattered. Before one particularly dangerous operation, he recorded Tony Clark speaking to his squad. "My daughter just started kindergarten last week. Kids in this city have daughters starting kindergarten too. Our job is to make sure all those little girls get to grow up and have normal lives. Anyone who tries to hurt them has to go through us first." The squad members nodded with expressions that HFY's equipment identified as fierce determination mixed with protective love. They were about to face overwhelming odds, but instead of being demoralized, they seemed eager to begin the mission. As he compiled his research data, HFY realized that conquering humanity would not be like conquering other species. Humans would not surrender when faced with superior technology. They would not be deterred by massive casualties. They would not negotiate for better terms. Instead, they would do what they had always done when facing existential threats. They would transform their love into weapons, their fear into fuel, and their desperation into determination. They would fight until every last human was dead. And they would somehow find ways to hurt their enemies that no military strategist could predict. Worse, they would inspire each other to impossible feats through their emotional connections. Every human death would make the survivors fight harder, not weaker. Every act of sacrifice would become a rallying cry that motivated others to similar heroism. For the first time in his life, Zexhai understood what it meant to be truly afraid. Not afraid of death or pain, but afraid of encountering something so fundamentally dangerous that it could destroy everything he thought he knew about intelligence, strength, and survival. The humans had weaponized love itself, and no amount of advanced technology could defend against an enemy willing to die for strangers. The journey back to the Kethmoran homeworld took 14 days, but Zexhai barely noticed the passage of time. He spent every waking hour reviewing his data and trying to find a way to explain what he had witnessed to beings who had never experienced emotions like fear, love, or self-sacrifice. His preliminary reports had already reached the High Command, and they had responded with increasing confusion and irritation. Admiral Keshatar had sent 3 messages demanding clarification about his claims that humans could fight beyond biological limitations. General Vexsmith had questioned whether his observation equipment was malfunctioning. Professor Velthera had been more direct in her criticism. Student Zexhai, your reports contain obvious errors. No species can sustain combat effectiveness with the injury levels you describe. No rational beings would choose certain death to protect unrelated individuals. Revise your data to reflect accurate observations. But Zexhai had checked and rechecked everything. His equipment was functioning perfectly. His recordings were clear and undeniable. The humans had done exactly what his reports described, and the implications terrified him more each day. As his transport ship approached the Kethmoran homeworld, he received orders to report directly to the High Command Chamber for immediate debriefing. The message indicated that his research would help finalize invasion plans for Earth. Fleet Admiral Thexdal wanted tactical assessments that would allow for quick conquest with minimal resource expenditure. The High Command Chamber was the most impressive room in the Empire, with walls that rose hundreds of meters into the artificial sky of the capital city. 12 of the most powerful Kethmoran sat behind a curved table that faced a single chair, where Zexhai would present his findings. Admiral Keshatar, the Supreme Military Commander, spoke first. Student researcher Zexhai, your preliminary reports have raised questions about the accuracy of your observations. Before we proceed with conquest planning, you will explain these apparent inconsistencies. Zexhai stood in the center of the vast chamber, feeling smaller than ever before. Honored commanders, I understand that my reports seem impossible, but every detail has been verified through multiple recording systems. You claim that human soldiers continued fighting with injuries that should have been fatal, said General Vexsmith. Our medical experts confirm that this is biologically impossible. You report that 53 humans successfully defended against a force of over 3,000, added Admiral Thexdal. Our tactical computers calculate this as statistically impossible. Fleet Commander Nalvex leaned forward with obvious impatience. Most ridiculous of all, you suggest that humans became more effective fighters when protecting others instead of themselves. This contradicts every principle of evolutionary biology. Zexhai activated his presentation system and projected the first video recording from the siege. Honored commanders, I request permission to show you the actual footage, rather than attempting to describe it in words. The chamber fell silent as the recording played. High-definition images showed Helen Burke continuing to fight at the main gate while bleeding from multiple wounds. The medical overlay clearly indicated injuries that should have rendered her unconscious. Yet she maintained accurate fire and tactical awareness for hours. Admiral Keshatar studied the data with all 6 eyes. This human female should be incapacitated by blood loss alone. Yes, Admiral, according to all known biological models. But she remained combat effective because she had decided that protecting civilian evacuees was more important than her own survival. That decision somehow allowed her to transcend normal physical limitations. The next recording showed Danny Cooper repairing critical defensive systems while under direct artillery fire. The explosions around him registered forces that should have killed him instantly, yet he completed complex technical work with steady hands. Equipment malfunction, declared General Vexsmith. No being can function normally under such stress. Zexhai had expected this response. I initially thought the same thing, General, but I have documented 847 similar incidents during the siege. In every case, humans performed tasks that should have been impossible when they were protecting others. He showed them Captain Stevens coordinating the entire defense while suffering from wounds that medical scanners indicated were mortal. Stevens had remained conscious and tactically effective for 18 hours past the point where his vital signs suggested he should have died. The High Command exchanged glances that Zexhai recognized as deep unease. These were beings who had conquered 47 worlds through superior technology and logical military planning. They had never encountered anything that challenged their understanding of how intelligent species behaved. Fleet Admiral Thexdal spoke carefully. Assuming your recordings are accurate, how do you explain these anomalies? Zexhai took a deep breath and delivered the words that would change everything. Honored commanders, humans possess something that our civilization eliminated long ago, during our logical evolution. They have the ability to choose values more important than their own survival, and that choice transforms them into something beyond normal biological limitations. Impossible, said Admiral Keshatar immediately. Individual survival is the primary drive of all intelligent life. Everything else is secondary, not for humans, Admiral. They can decide that protecting others is more important than living. When they make that choice, they become capable of things that our science cannot explain or predict. Zexhai activated another recording, this one showing Jake Morrison speaking to his squad before the siege began. Watch their faces, commanders. Listen to their words. They are not being forced to stay and fight. They are choosing certain death to buy time for civilian evacuation. The recording played Morrison's speech about staying behind to protect the village. The High Command watched in silence as 8 human soldiers voluntarily accepted a suicide mission to save strangers they had never met. This makes no evolutionary sense, muttered General Vexsmith. It makes perfect sense if you understand that humans value their connections to others more than their individual existence, Zexhai replied. They have weaponized love, commanders. Their emotional attachments do not make them weak. They make them unlimited. He showed them footage of human parents speaking about children who had died protecting civilians. Instead of grief and anger, they expressed pride and honor. They celebrated their offspring for living up to human ideals of self-sacrifice and protection of innocence. Fleet Commander Nalvex leaned back in obvious distress. You are suggesting that an entire species is willing to die for abstract concepts. Not just willing, Commander. Eager. They compete with each other to make sacrifices for their ideals. Their greatest heroes are those who died protecting others. Their highest honor is to be remembered for choosing duty over survival. Zexhai activated his final recording, a compilation of human military communications during critical moments of various battles. Soldiers calling out positions of wounded comrades while under fire, medics running into dangerous zones to treat enemies, pilots deliberately crashing damaged aircraft into military targets to complete their missions. Every human military in history has displayed this same pattern, he explained. The more hopeless their situation becomes, the more dangerous they become. Fear motivates them to fight harder. Love makes them willing to die for others. Grief transforms into unstoppable determination. The High Command chamber remained silent for long minutes. These ancient beings had built their empire on the logical principle that all species would surrender when facing overwhelming force. The idea that an entire civilization might choose death over submission was beyond their comprehension. Finally, Admiral Keshatar spoke. What is your tactical recommendation, researcher? Zexhai straightened and delivered the words that would destroy his academic career, but save his species. Honored commanders, conquest of humanity is not just difficult, it is impossible. They cannot be defeated because they refuse to accept defeat. They cannot be intimidated because they value their ideals more than their lives. Any attack on Earth would result in a war that would destroy both civilizations. Unacceptable, said Fleet Admiral Thexdal immediately. No primitive species can threaten the Kethmoran Empire. With respect, Admiral, humans are not primitive. They are something far more dangerous. They are unlimited by the fear of death when protecting what they love. I recommend immediate diplomatic contact to establish alliance rather than conquest. The debate that followed lasted for hours, but Zexhai knew his warnings would be ignored. The High Command could not accept that their advanced civilization might be vulnerable to a species that fought with primitive weapons and impossible courage. As he was dismissed from the chamber, stripped of his research credentials and facing exile for his recommendations, Zexhai made one final decision that honored what he had learned from studying humans. He activated a hidden, communication system and sent a message toward Earth using frequencies that human radio telescopes could detect. The message was simple but urgent. We were coming to conquer you. Instead, you conquered our understanding of courage. Your greatest weakness is your greatest strength. Perhaps we can learn from each other instead of destroying each other.